4 men, 4 screams, 4 bodies crushed beneath the hooves of horses they once owned. The official report called it an accident. The witnesses called it divine justice. But the stable master who walked away that night never spoke another word about what really happened in the paddock behind Riverside Estate. And perhaps that silence was the most terrifying part of all. The sound of hooves on flesh is something you never forget. It's not like the movies. There's no dramatic music, no slow motion, just the wet, heavy thud of 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone colliding with a human body. And then, the screaming. Always the screaming. On the night of September 14, 1864, that sound echoed across the tobacco fields of Riverside Estate in southern Virginia. 4 men died that night, trampled to death by their own horses in what the county coroner would later describe as a tragic accident of unprecedented nature. But accidents don't usually involve 4 separate victims. Accidents don't usually happen to men who've spent their entire lives around horses. And accidents certainly don't leave behind a stable master who disappears into the night without a trace, never to be seen again. The estate still stands today, though the paddock where it happened has long since been paved over. The descendants of those 4 men still live in the area, their family names carved into monuments at the local cemetery. But if you ask them about that night, about what really happened when their great-great-grandfathers died screaming in the dirt, they'll tell you they don't know. Or perhaps more accurately, they'll tell you they don't want to know. Because some stories are better left buried, some truths are too dark to speak aloud, and some revenge is so perfectly executed that even a century and a half later, it still sends chills down your spine. This is the story of Thomas Garrett, a stable master who spent 15 years caring for horses he would never own, serving men who saw him as less than human. This is the story of 4 masters who believed their wealth and status made them untouchable. And this is the story of one night in 1864 when everything changed. The thing about revenge is that it's patient. It waits, it watches, it learns, and when the moment finally comes, when all the pieces fall into place, it strikes with a precision that seems almost supernatural. But there was nothing supernatural about what happened at Riverside Estate. What happened there was purely human, which somehow makes it even more terrifying. Before we continue with the story of Riverside Estate and the men who died there, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What state? What city? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're ready to dive into one of the darkest tales of revenge in American history, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Riverside Estate sat on 300 acres of prime Virginia tobacco land, about 12 miles south of Richmond. The main house was a testament to antebellum wealth. White columns, wraparound porches, and windows that caught the morning sun just right. Behind it, a network of barns, stables, and outbuildings spread across the property like a small village. And at the heart of it all was the stable, where some of the finest horses in Virginia were kept. The estate belonged to the Harrington family, but by 1864, ownership had become complicated. The Civil War had been raging for 3 years, and the Confederate cause was beginning to crumble. Richmond itself would fall to Union forces within 7 months. But in September of 1864, the men of Riverside Estate still clung to their old way of life with desperate determination. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the world these men inhabited. Virginia in 1864 was a place of contradictions. The old plantation system was dying, but its practitioners refused to acknowledge it. The war had devastated the economy, destroyed infrastructure, and killed thousands of young men. Yet the wealthy planters continued to believe they could maintain their lifestyle through sheer force of will. Riverside Estate had been in the Harrington family for 3 generations. Old William Harrington had built it in 1798 with money from tobacco and slave labor. His son, Edmund Sr., had expanded it during the prosperous 1830s and 1840s, and now Edmund Jr. and his brother Charles were watching it slowly crumble around them, unable or unwilling to adapt to changing times. The estate had once employed over 100 enslaved people. By 1864, that number had dropped to 43. Some had been sold to raise money, others had escaped to Union lines. A few had died from disease or overwork. The remaining slaves lived in a state of constant anxiety, knowing their world was ending but uncertain what would replace it. There were 4 men who mattered that night. 4 men whose names would be etched into local history, though not in the way they would have wanted. First was Edmund Harrington, the eldest son and nominal owner of the estate. At 42, he was a man who'd never worked a day in his life, but considered himself an expert on everything from politics to agriculture. He'd avoided military service through a combination of wealth and medical exemptions, claiming a weak heart that never seemed to affect his ability to drink whiskey or beat his slaves. Edmund was a man of contradictions. He could quote Shakespeare and discuss philosophy, yet he saw nothing wrong with owning human beings. He prided himself on being a benevolent master, which in his mind meant he only had slaves whipped for serious infractions rather than minor ones. He genuinely believed he was doing his slaves a favor by providing them with food and shelter, never acknowledging that he was the one who'd taken their freedom in the first place. His wife, Margaret, had died in 1859, giving birth to their 4th child. The child had died too. Edmund had mourned for exactly 3 months before taking up with a woman in Richmond, visiting her every Thursday with money he could barely afford to spend. His 3 surviving children were raised by enslaved women who had no choice in the matter. Then there was his brother, Charles Harrington, 3 years younger and twice as cruel. Charles had served briefly with the Confederate cavalry before a riding accident sent him home. The accident had left him with a permanent limp and a burning resentment toward anyone he perceived as beneath him, which was nearly everyone. Charles had never married. He lived in the east wing of the main house, drinking too much and nursing grievances against a world that hadn't given him the glory he felt he deserved. He'd been a handsome man once, but years of alcohol and bitterness had left him bloated and red-faced. He took out his frustrations on the estate's slaves, finding excuses to inflict punishments for the smallest infractions. The accident that had ended his military career had happened during a training exercise. His horse had refused a jump, and Charles had been thrown. The horse had been a spirited young mare named Tempest, and Charles had blamed her for his humiliation. He'd wanted to have her shot, but Edmund had refused, arguing the horse was too valuable. So Charles had kept her instead, riding her hard and punishing her for perceived disobedience. It was his way of maintaining control over something, anything, in a life that increasingly felt beyond his grasp. The 3rd man was Marcus Whitfield, Edmund's brother-in-law and business partner. He owned the neighboring property and had invested heavily in Riverside's tobacco operation. Marcus was a calculating man, the kind who kept detailed ledgers of every penny spent and every slave purchased. He saw human beings as numbers on a balance sheet, assets to be managed and exploited for maximum profit. Marcus was 50 years old, thin and precise, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He'd married Edmund's sister Catherine 20 years earlier in what everyone knew was a business arrangement. Catherine had brought a substantial dowry, and Marcus had brought connections in Richmond's banking circles. They had no children, which suited Marcus fine. Children were expensive and unpredictable. He visited Riverside Estate 3 times a week to review the books and discuss business with Edmund. He had a particular interest in the horses, seeing them as valuable assets that could be liquidated if necessary. He'd been the one to suggest purchasing Thomas Garrett 15 years earlier, recognizing that a skilled stable master would increase the value of their equine investments. Marcus prided himself on his rationality. He didn't beat slaves out of anger or cruelty, but out of cold calculation. He believed that measured punishment was necessary to maintain discipline and productivity. He kept records of every whipping, every punishment, noting the infraction and the result. In his mind, this made him more civilized than men like Charles who acted out of emotion. The 4th was Daniel Cross, the estate's overseer. Unlike the others, Daniel had come from modest means. He'd worked his way up from nothing, and that made him the most dangerous of all. He knew what it was like to be powerless, and he'd vowed never to be powerless again. His solution was to exercise absolute control over everyone beneath him, ruling the estate's enslaved population with systematic brutality. Daniel was 38 years old, broad-shouldered and strong from years of physical labor. He'd been born to a poor farming family in North Carolina, the youngest of 7 children. He'd left home at 15 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to make something of himself. He'd worked as a field hand, a mill worker, a dock laborer. He'd saved every penny, taught himself to read and write, and eventually secured a position as an assistant overseer on a plantation in South Carolina. He'd proven himself ruthless and efficient, and when Edmund Harrington had needed a new overseer in 1858, Daniel had been recommended. Daniel lived in a small house on the edge of the estate, separate from both the main house and the slave quarters. He had no family, no friends, no life outside his work. His entire identity was wrapped up in his position, in the power it gave him over others. He carried a whip at all times, and he wasn't afraid to use it. What made Daniel particularly dangerous was his intelligence. He understood the psychology of control. He knew how to break people down, how to make them afraid, how to maintain order through a combination of violence and unpredictability. He would sometimes show mercy to create hope, then crush that hope to reinforce despair. It was calculated, methodical, and devastatingly effective. These 4 men met every Wednesday evening in the estate study to discuss business, drink imported brandy, and congratulate themselves on their superiority. They called themselves the Riverside Council, as if they were statesmen rather than what they really were. 4 men desperately trying to maintain a dying system through violence and intimidation. Their Wednesday meetings had become a ritual. They would gather at 7 o'clock after dinner. Edmund would pour the brandy, expensive stuff smuggled through the Union blockade at considerable cost. They would smoke cigars, also smuggled, and discuss the week's business. The meetings always followed the same pattern. Marcus would review the financial situation, which was invariably grim. Tobacco prices were falling. The Union blockade was making it impossible to export their crop. Labor costs were rising as slaves became harder to control and more likely to escape. The war was bleeding them dry. Then Edmund would offer optimistic platitudes about how things would improve once the Confederacy won the war. Charles would complain about something, usually the slaves or the Yankees or his leg. Daniel would report on discipline issues and recommend punishments. And they would all drink and convince themselves that their world wasn't ending. But it was ending. They all knew it, even if they wouldn't admit it. The Confederacy was losing. The slave system was collapsing. Their way of life were terrified. That terror made them more dangerous. Desperate men do desperate things. And in the summer of 1864, the men of Riverside Estate were very desperate indeed. And then there was Thomas Garrett. Thomas had been at Riverside Estate for 15 years. He'd arrived in 1849 as a young man of 20, purchased at auction in Richmond for the specific purpose of managing the estate's horses. His previous owner had trained him well. Thomas could calm a spooked stallion with a whisper, diagnose lameness from a horse's gait, and deliver a foal with the skill of any veterinarian. He was, by all accounts, the finest stablemaster in 3 counties. But Thomas was property. He slept in a small room above the stable, ate whatever scraps were brought to him, and wore the same clothes until they fell apart. He was never allowed to marry, though he'd loved a woman named Ruth who worked in the main house. He'd watched her die of fever in 1857, denied even the dignity of sitting with her in her final hours because Edmund Harrington needed a horse saddled for an afternoon ride. Thomas had been born into slavery in 1829 on a horse-breeding farm in Kentucky. His mother had been a house servant, his father a stable hand. He'd never known his father's name. The man had been sold when Thomas was 3 years old, sent to a plantation in Mississippi. Thomas had only vague memories of him, large hands, a deep voice, the smell of hay and leather. His mother had died when he was 12. Fever, like Ruth. Thomas had been alone after that, raised by the other slaves in the quarters. learning his trade from an old stablemaster named Benjamin, who'd recognized the boy's natural talent with horses. Benjamin had taught him everything: how to read a horse's mood from the position of its ears, how to treat colic, thrush, founder, how to train a young horse without breaking its spirit, how to deliver a foal when the birth went wrong. Benjamin had been patient and kind, the closest thing to a father Thomas had ever known. When Benjamin died in 1848, Thomas had been devastated, but he'd also inherited Benjamin's knowledge, his skills, his reputation, and that reputation had made him valuable. Valuable enough that when his owner had fallen on hard times, he'd been able to sell Thomas for a premium price to Edmund Harrington. Thomas had arrived at Riverside Estate with hope. It was foolish, he knew, but he couldn't help it. Maybe this place would be different. Maybe these masters would be kinder. Maybe he could build something resembling a life. That hope had died slowly over the years. Death by 1,000 cuts. Each casual cruelty, each humiliation, each reminder that he was property, not a person. The hope had died, but Thomas had survived. Because that's what he did. He survived. The horses, though. The horses were different. Thomas cared for 17 horses at Riverside Estate. He knew each one by name, by temperament, by the particular way they liked to be brushed or the specific spot behind their ears that made them nicker with contentment. He delivered their foals, nursed them through illness, trained them with patience and kindness. And in return, the horses trusted him completely. There was Sovereign, Edmund's magnificent bay stallion. 16 hands high, with a coat that gleamed like polished mahogany in the sun. Sovereign was proud and spirited, but he'd never given Thomas a moment's trouble. The horse would come when called, stand patiently for grooming, and nuzzle Thomas's shoulder with genuine affection. Tempest was Charles's grey mare, the one that had thrown him during the war. She was nervous and high-strung, prone to spooking at shadows. But with Thomas she was calm. She would rest her head against his chest and blow softly through her nostrils, a sign of trust and contentment. Midnight was Marcus's black gelding, steady and reliable. Not flashy but dependable, the kind of horse you could count on. Thomas had trained Midnight from a yearling, and the bond between them was strong. And then there was Brutus, Daniel's young chestnut stallion, only 3 years old, still learning, still testing boundaries. Brutus was intelligent and energetic, full of potential. Thomas was training him carefully, patiently, building trust and respect rather than fear. These 4 horses, and the 13 others in the stable, were Thomas's world. They were the only beings on the estate who treated him with genuine affection. They didn't see him as property. They saw him as the person who fed them, cared for them, understood them. And Thomas loved them for it. But he also watched, day after day, as the 4 men who owned these horses treated them with casual cruelty. Edmund used spurs that drew blood. Thomas would find Sovereign in his stall after a ride, sides heaving, foam on his mouth, blood trickling from where the spurs had dug in. He would clean the wounds, apply salve, whisper apologies the horse couldn't understand. Charles whipped Tempest across the face when she balked at a jump. Thomas had seen it happen once, had watched the mare rear up in pain and fear, had seen the welt rise across her delicate nose. He'd wanted to intervene, to stop it, but he couldn't. Interfering would mean punishment, possibly death. So he'd stood there, helpless, and watched. Marcus rode Midnight until the horse was lathered and trembling, then left him standing in the cold. Thomas would find the gelding shivering in the paddock, exhausted and neglected, and would have to spend hours warming him up, preventing colic, undoing the damage of Marcus's indifference. Daniel beat Brutus with a riding crop for the simple crime of being young and spirited. The stallion would shy at something or pull at the reins or show any sign of independence, and Daniel would beat him, not to train him, but to dominate him, to prove who was in control. Thomas said nothing. He couldn't. Speaking out meant punishment, possibly death. So he kept his head down, did his work, and tried not to think about the injustice of it all. He tried not to think about Ruth, cold in the ground. He tried not to think about the scars on his own back from the times he'd been whipped for imagined infractions. He tried not to think about the fact that he was 35 years old and would likely die in this stable, having never known freedom, never known justice, never known anything but servitude. But trying not to think about something and succeeding are two very different things. The summer of 1864 was brutal. The heat pressed down on Virginia like a physical weight, making every breath feel like work. The tobacco plants wilted in the fields despite constant watering. The horses stood in their stalls, heads hanging, too hot to do anything but endure. And the war news grew worse by the day. Confederate defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg the previous year had turned the tide, and now Union forces were slowly tightening their grip around Richmond. General Grant had launched his overland campaign in May, and though the fighting had been costly for both sides, it was clear the Union had the resources to sustain losses that the Confederacy didn't. The men of Riverside Estate grew increasingly agitated. Their Wednesday meetings lasted longer and grew louder. Thomas could hear them through the wall the stable shared with the study, their voices rising in anger and frustration as they discussed their deteriorating situation. He tried not to listen. It wasn't his business. But sound carried through the old wood, and sometimes he couldn't help but overhear. "We're bleeding money," Marcus said one night in early August. "The tobacco's rotting in the warehouses because we can't ship it. The slaves are costing more to feed than they're producing, and the Confederate dollar is worthless." "It'll turn around," Edmund insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Once we win a few more battles, once the Yankees realize they can't break us." "The Yankees have already broken us," Charles interrupted. "We just haven't admitted it yet." There was a long silence. Then Daniel spoke, his voice cold and practical. "We need to liquidate assets, sell what we can while there's still a market. Slaves, horses, land if necessary. Get hard currency and wait out the storm. Sell the horses." Edmund sounded horrified. "These are some of the finest animals in Virginia. They're worth whatever someone will pay," Marcus cut in. "And right now, that's not much. But it's better than nothing." Thomas felt his heart sink. They were going to sell the horses. His horses. The only beings on this estate who mattered to him. But then Marcus continued and Thomas's world shifted. "The horses are our most valuable remaining assets. If we're forced to evacuate, we'll need them. But we can't take Garrett with us." Thomas froze, the brush still in his hand, Sovereign's warm flank pressed against his side. "Why not?" Edmund asked. "He's the best stable master in Virginia." "Exactly. Which means he's valuable. We sell him in Richmond before we leave, get whatever price we can, use the money to establish ourselves elsewhere." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. They were going to sell him. After 15 years, after everything he'd done, they were going to sell him like a piece of furniture. "What about the horses?" Charles asked. "Who will manage them if we sell Garrett?" "We'll hire someone," Marcus said dismissively. "A white man. Someone we can trust." Trust. The word echoed in Thomas's mind. 15 years of perfect service and they didn't trust him. 15 years of caring for their animals, better than they cared for their own children, and he was still just property to be liquidated when convenient. "I say we do it next week," Daniel added. "Get it done before the market gets any worse. War's making prices drop." They discussed it for another hour, debating his value like he was a horse himself. Thomas listened to every word, and something inside him, something that had been compressed and buried for 15 years, finally cracked. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his small room above the stable, listening to the horses moving in their stalls below, and he thought about Ruth. He thought about the scars on his back. He thought about every indignity, every cruelty, every moment of powerlessness. And he thought about the horses. The horses trusted him. The horses loved him. The horses would do anything he asked. An idea began to form. It was terrible. It was unthinkable. It was also perfectly beautiful.